I'm Dan James, creator and presenter of Renew Kids on the Block, the podcast about all things Renew. Welcome, Annabel, and thank you for joining us here on the Renew Kids on the Block podcast, the very first inaugural episode, one might say. I'd like to start off just by the simple, sort of most obvious question. What brought you to Renew? How did you come to join this particular movement?
Well, it was great. I was working with Advance, which is a party that I helped set up with other people in Kensington and Chelsea, and we wanted to change the conversation in politics locally and to have an impact. And once we'd done that in the recent local elections, we then started chatting to Renew and the people involved with Renew, and we realised that we have more in common, and that what we wanted to do on a local level, we could start to do on a national scale. And that seemed very appealing for everyone within Advance. And we could bring skills that Renew didn't have and start to, help and grow everything that we've been trying to do on a local level to a national piece.
Thank you. That sounds great. Now, I guess the offshoot to that is there's a lot of groups that we've seen that have sprung up after the Brexit referendum, Best for Britain, Scientists for the EU, all of these sorts of groups. How did Advance and how does Renew now differ from those sorts of groups?
Well, our primary thing is we're actually a political party, so we can actually stand in elections. We are aimed at bringing new people to politics. So Advance ran 14 new candidates who'd never been involved in politics before, and they stood in the local elections, and we kind of showed them the ropes of how to do it and bring their brilliant knowledge and expertise and their lived experiences to help change the way politics is done, because fundamentally we feel that the system needs radical reform, positive disruption to create a better way and a better system fit for the 21st century. And so that's what we're doing with Renew now.
And that's a fascinating point, because I think most of us would agree, especially over the last few months, we've seen the extent to which the mainstream political parties just seem to be letting the public down. We've seen infighting in both Labour and the Tories. We've seen the Lib Dems fail to get any traction whatsoever. UKIP, thankfully, I think we can all agree, basically imploding every other month with the new leader coming around. And when Nigel Farage feels you're a bit too racist, I feel you may have jumped some sort of shark. So is it fair to say that Renew is hoping to build off of this frustration and this sense that the public has been disappointed and isn't being served by the traditional Westminster parties?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I feel that people look at us and say, I have become politically homeless. The party that I have voted for all my life broadly has moved away to an extreme and has taken the ideology to an extent that people don't understand anymore. So I felt politically homeless, and I couldn't understand how any of the institutional parties could provide a place for me to put my vote. In the May elections, people came up to us and said, you gave me hope for the future. You provided a home for me, and I was proud to put my cross next to you. I was voting for something, not against something else. And that's what Renew is working on, and that is where we're trying to find our place. So I know the Lib Dems seem to have effectively dissipated completely. They're really struggling, and obviously they've recently lost an MP as well. And then additionally, you've got the two main parties who have just become sort of parodies in themselves, and they just don't provide any hope to the future. And they're not answering any of the questions that people have told us are the things that really matter to them.
And on that, obviously Brexit sort of takes up all the air in the room when it comes to politics these days. But from my point of view, that phrase of being politically homeless is something that's resonated with me for years now. I have, over my course of time in the UK, I've lived here for 13 years, and I've voted Labour sometimes, I've voted Lib Dem sometimes, I've voted Green. And a lot of people look at groups like Renew, look at political parties like Renew, and say, oh, it's just a one-issue party around Brexit. But to me, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, it feels like that's gone back a long way, and it's Tory austerity, and it's the divisions between Labour that go back 20, 30 years. And I just kind of wondered if you could sort of comment on that.
Yeah, I think that Brexit is sort of the tipping point for a lot of problems and that have been stored up over the past decades, and austerity and the lies around why we needed to have austerity, which is actually in so many ways a political choice rather than anything else. And then, of course, Brexit, which has become, was completely surrounded by lies. And I don't think either campaign came out, showing their true, really honest colours. And I think all of the sort of the way that we have encourage and the way that the two-party system in this country, it discourages people from actually being, working in areas that aren't their target winning seats, because why bother? You're not going to win. It's always, that horrible phrase of, oh, you could pin a blue or red rosette on a donkey here and it wouldn't be a problem. They'd always win. And you think that is the saddest thing. So our democracy has effectively encouraged this lazy system. And so people don't fight for their areas. And you see it with someone like the Lib Dems, in the last election, they only had 50 target seats. Well, how is that a national party by any stretch of the imagination? And there's a kind of a scorched earth policy where they ignore all of the areas that they aren't targeting because they have to put their resources into these. But then actually, whilst the system itself, and that's our main thing, encourages that, you actually can't build up a national party if you are only focusing on these small areas. And the one thing that really struck me last year when I was running in the general election was the way that we actually changed the face of an area for the first time in its history. It changed to a different colour. And whilst that wasn't necessarily the colour I wanted it to be, it actually changed its thinking a little bit. And people said it was really encouraging to see that there could actually change is possible. And there's also that, I think, that the problem with the two-party system, it's so difficult to get that. And I think that's what Renew is really very much about, is supporting people to help encourage that.
So one of the things that makes me think of is we see a lot of times people seeming to vote seemingly from the outside objectively against their own best interests. And we've seen, again, with Brexit, Westminster write a check that Sunderland is going to have to cash. How do we break people out of that cycle in those areas that are so deep red? I mean, you mentioned giving people something to vote for, which is great. How do we get that message out to people that, hey, listen, it doesn't have to just be Labour or Tory, whichever one your parents have voted for, but there is actually a new option out there without. How do we get out of the idea that we're just a sort of fringe party that's never going to make it any better than the Lib Dems or whoever else?
I mean, there are sort of few answers to this. I think what was really interesting is that last year, for the first time, a lot of people voted in a way that historically they'd never voted for. So a lot of people, and Brexit has compelled them into changing their party allegiance for the first time ever. And once you break that almost unseen chord, it starts to be possible to look at other options. And then, in addition, you realise that the power of a party like UKIP, which has never won a national MP election, and yet it managed to change the face of our country's political policy and the traction and where we're headed, was entirely about power of votes. So we as a party, with the number of candidates that we have and with the ability across social media, and I'm very grateful for social media, however much Facebook is, I mean, let's face it, a pretty appalling beast, but what it allows us to do is actually to hit people with our messaging about rejecting the lies and reforming politics and rebooting Britain. And that messaging we can get out in a way that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. And so, for the first time, people have become unhooked from their allegiances, and now we can actually start broadly talking to them. And that picks up when candidates start to retweet us more, and on Facebook they start to like stuff. So there's lots of different ways that we can start to gain traction, which wasn't even feasible 15 years ago.
So one of the challenges, I guess, that comes off of that, if we use UKIP as an example, UKIP reached its success by creating this idea that Nigel Farage was somehow a man of the people and appealing, one might say pandering if one were even slightly cynical or, self-aware, to a certain demographic, many of whom voted, the majority of whom, well, in fact, probably all of whom presumably voted to leave the EU, and many of whom will be hardest hit by its effects. One of the countersides to that I've seen within Renew is there is a sort of London-heavy aspect to the number of candidates who are running and so forth. How do we overcome the perception, especially given how much of Brexit was fueled by anti-London, perceived anti-elite sentiment? Pardon me.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because obviously we've pulled people from both sides of the Brexit equation, and we have candidates who voted Leave, and having seen the way it's going, it wasn't what they were expecting, it wasn't what they identify with. And I think a lot of them felt, particularly around the immigration issue, which we are very positive that immigration is good for the future of our country, that without it being open borders, that it brings in more than it takes away. And that is going to appeal more in an urban environment. There's no doubt about that. And of course, there is the ease in which in London you can get around. So what our big thing is to make sure that we are getting out to across the country, and we're very lucky. We've now got candidates in Aberdeen, we've got candidates, in Exeter, we've got candidates in Cornwall. We go all to the sort of the right to the edges in Cardiff, and then so we're pushing on making sure that we go out and meet people, and that we make sure that they understand that we are there, and that we want them to be part of everything that we're doing, whether it's about voting on policy, where it's about the way we talk to people. We had a guy in today who's a new candidate, and he is going to run in Ipswich. And, so we are beginning to reach out beyond. In fact, the Midlands is one of our biggest areas of support, which is quite interesting, because obviously that had an overwhelming Leave vote, really. People kind of say, yes, you are too urban, and we try not to be too London-centric. We are working very hard not to be. And just like anything, whether it's about race, colour or creed, if you are looking like the people you want to represent, they want to get involved. And that's exactly our aim.
So then, as we reach out to the four corners of the UK, as it were, how do we, one of the big issues as well, obviously, is the North-South divide, and that kind of comes off the back of there's London centricity or perception thereof in general, but there's a further North-South divide that's there. We've seen things like HS2, which I personally am a big fan of infrastructure projects, but it's a 32-year, 20 billion pound project, or 80. It's a very expensive project. I looked behind the sofa cushions and couldn't buy myself an HS2, basically. So what sort of moves do you think can be put into place to try to heal that divide?
I mean, with so many things, this is about education and regional investment. And we have a very strong policy where we're looking at the way that we invest in regional transport links. Down in Devizes, they've had problems with their transport links for so long. And HS2 is a really interesting question, actually, because it was a political choice. It's going to be hugely over budget. It's certainly looking like 80 billion. Is that worthwhile when you think of what you could do to other regional transport networks? And what's interesting about HS2 is there was HS3, which I don't think we're going to get to because HS2 is going to go so over budget. And there were other ways that you could do a similar line with HS2 because we have an old line that could be refreshed at a cheaper cost. And HS3 is really the thing that was the most important part of the equation. And of course, that potentially won't come if HS2 goes so over budget. And so it's getting out to the regions and understanding how, I was in Blackpool recently, and the guy said to me, I couldn't afford to go to my job interview in Manchester. I didn't have the money. Now that to us is lost opportunity. That is, and that's just not how we want to be. We need to understand, that investment and carefully considered investment, which I question whether HS2 is the right way to do this because of the amount of money it takes. What about electrifying the north and making sure that we have enough so that people understand that buying in, and working with electric cars might be the future in order to encourage that. And then, of course, there's sustainable solutions there as well. So I think it's around those sorts of options rather than these massive glory projects that don't necessarily achieve what they're set out to do.
So to shift gears a little bit, staying on Brexit, but looking at a different cut of demographics. One of the most stark demographics in the 2016 referendum was around age. And if young people under 35 had voted, it would have been a walk in the park. It would have been a very different outcome. And I've seen projections that say that actually, even if you redid the vote now, just accounting for the number of old voters who have, better or worse, gone beyond, shall we say, and new voters who have turned 18 in the last 2.5 years, the outcome might very well be different. But the problem is older voters vote in very large numbers, and the young tend not to. What can we do to fix this, and why do you think young people are so disincentivized at the moment to vote?
That's a really interesting question, and the only thing I'd say is it's not really a problem when people want to vote. Saying that older people want to vote is a problem. I want everyone to vote, and in fact, we have toyed with some ideas in our policy platform around making it mandatory for people to vote, and it's really interesting the way people interact with that as a poll, and we've done it on all our different platforms. And actually, we found that 70% supported the idea of mandatory voting, so just like the Australian system. But what I thought was really fascinating is the discussion around it, whether it's a duty, whether it's a right, whether that actually it should become, and how those interact was really interesting. I think the problem is that in so many ways people don't see the effect of politics on their lives. I mean, the greatest irony, of course, is that there's a huge impact of politics. I mean, Brexit's going to have absolutely enormous ramifications, whatever type of, especially for the young, and the opportunities to travel and the way that it works and the investment opportunities and what it's going to do to all of those sorts of things. It's going to be enormous. And, my kids are going to be feeling the effects of it, and they're, toddlers. What I think we need to try and encourage is to be able to have the understanding and the ownership of power in their lives. And actually a part of the system problem is that it's all so focused on Westminster that, local government doesn't have the power it needs to make the decisions. So if we can encourage, and this is part of our reforms, is that we want the power to be based where that locally to the decision that it's going to affect, so that we devolve power much more and people start to see that they can have an impact. You could be a local councillor in your area. You're going to be paid a bit better. We're going to make it, professionalise it. We're going to make it a much better system so that you actually see the effect you have on your local community. And then, there are some really interesting young MPs as well. Myra Black, who she and I could not disagree more around the whole union. She's a nationalist and we are not. But I love the way that her style has come and brought, a difference. And, she's really questioned the way things are. And actually it's people like that who begin to challenge the status quo and the way the system of parliament's set up, which is just, if you're parents, it's a nightmare. You can't get home for your kids. I mean, it just doesn't work in the same sort of hours. So there's lots of, there's in the States, they've also got some really interesting ideas around Run for Something, which is a group who support young people under 35 to run in elections. And so that kind of support I'm keen to create with Renew so that we can push people to be involved.
And is there something to be said in terms of encouraging people to vote, whether young or old, around looking at the emotive and the emotional side of things? And one of the things that seemed to me very stark, especially looking back on the referendum, was that the Leave campaign made all these impassioned emotional arguments about sovereignty and about immigration and all of these things, and Remain made what I feel are very sensible arguments as an engineer, but they were economic projections and GDP forecasts and WTO projections, and that in some ways was a harder sell and tougher for people to get their heads around. So how do we make an emotional case for staying in Europe, and how do we make an emotional case for everybody to get involved with politics and say this is not a spectator sport?
I think part of it is us. You're right, the messaging around the referendum was terrible in so many ways. The morning after, I woke up in tears, and the first text message I get is and text message shows how old I am, but from my next door neighbour who's Polish, who's a really good friend, and she was deeply upset that she felt that the country she'd made her home didn't want her anymore. I take my kid to nursery, and my friend who's Spanish is in tears because she's like, what does this mean for the future in our country? To me, it was very emotional, the whole thing, but that wasn't the kind of the discussion we went around, and certainly the areas that I canvassed in for Remain in London, it was all about, the economic benefits and all these things. And it's proved to be, irrespective of the fact that EU migration is positive in terms of economics, it doesn't seem to affect people. And what really upset me about it was the idea that I'm losing my citizenship. My European citizenship is being stripped from me. And it's interesting, my husband's 5-6 years older than me, and he doesn't feel that in the same way. And I can see that there's a bit of a divide. So we hit either side of the original referendum. And I think there's something a little bit telling in that, actually, that the age thing is different. So what I am very keen on, and we luckily have a really good social media team in the Renew offices who are focused on resonating messages, and they're all also like young enough to be my kids, which is a bit depressing, but but they producing messaging and we've worked really hard to change our branding to make it more approachable, to make it much more tactile, to pop on social media, to pop so that people feel like this is something I'm interested in, this is interesting, I can be part of this, I can have a conversation here. We're also producing a digital democracy platform so people can really engage with all our policy, and they can say they like it, they don't like it, they want to do this with it, they think about it, and that can help to drill down and will actually be the policy that we then run on in an election.
If it'll make you feel better, I also tend to find most things newer than text messaging, and especially Twitter particularly confusing. So I'm with you on that one. But I wanted to ask specifically about something you mentioned there, which was a sense of almost betrayal that you were talking about your neighbor mentioning to you, and a number of my European friends and myself. I'm a dual national now, but I'm Canadian originally. And so the referendum wasn't strictly speaking about me, but it was to an extent about immigration in general. And I think let's pretend that everything goes amazing and somehow we manage to steer away from Brexit. For that matter, even if we don't, there is, I fear, a generation of healing that's going to need to go on. And even if we stay in the union, first of all, we've lost nurses, we've lost doctors, we've lost plumbers, we've lost entrepreneurs who have said, I don't feel welcome here, I'm going back to my home country, I'm out. And they're not going to come back if we suddenly rescind Article 50. But even amongst those who have stayed, maybe because their kids grew up here, maybe because their spouse is from here, maybe just because, for all the betrayal, they still feel that this should be their home, there's still a feeling of betrayal and of the country I call home doesn't want me. How can we go about trying to recover from that in, let's say, the great event that we're able to rescind Article 50?
Yeah, do you know what was something that I thought really struck me after the referendum is somebody said to me, now we all have empathy for each other. And so those communities who felt that there'd been too much immigration, and they felt that they had been stripped bare, that they hadn't had the resources, and this is policy decisions by those parties, they hadn't been understood by those of us who liked immigration and felt that it was positive. And so we now all understood each other's position. There is at least the empathy of understanding that in your own country, you don't necessarily feel that you're home. And there are lots of things that we can do, because trying to bridge that divide is the kind of thing that actually, I think, quite sadly, keeps me awake at night, because, when you are bringing up young kids, you want them to be, you want to think that their future is going to be bright. And at the moment, it seems a bit we're so consumed by what's going on that trying to find a path through, and that sort of ignoring the the rubbish policies coming out of the different parties and the consistent anti-immigrant rhetoric that I think is so depressing. And finding us a way to sort of say, do you know what, it can be positive. We can create this in the communities that have suffered and felt that they have been left behind. That's an education piece. And so one of our big ideas is that we want to give everyone the kind of sure start in life so that you can grow up with an aspiration. Every child who's 5 and 6 and 7 should be thinking about maybe being a spaceman. That's cool. If they don't want to be that and they don't end up being, that's fine. But the idea that they dream of that's really important. And I think we have to sort of align that. But also, we are an aging population, and we need to think about how we look after our elderly, and we're failing to do that. And the vulnerable, that's where, as a society, I think, and as a civilized society, we should be at our best, and we're just not. And so I think there's pieces around investment, but there's also about being compassionate and looking after people. And I think that's about how we frame everything that we're doing. So this hostile environment that was created, that just needs to go. And I think there's so many different things that we can do in the way we talk about things, in the policies that we produce, and of course in the way that we actually make sure that our candidates do cross across, ages and sex and, you name it, so that we just are of the people rather than talking to them.
So I have time for one last question. So that makes me think a little bit of, so one of the things that I always look back on in 2016 was then Prime Minister David Cameron. He had faced significant opposition from the right side, from UKIP, and specifically around the issues of immigration. And in my mind, I sometimes think of Brexit as kind of Cameron's folly, because I think a true leader faces that and says, "No, I'm not gonna pander. I'm not gonna kowtow to that radical wing, but I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna be a leader, and I'm gonna go out there and tell you why immigration is good, and it's not for want of statistics or want of information. It is, as you said, provably true that that's the case. But I think more than that, it felt to me like a bit of a betrayal of British values, and that kind of goes back to the previous question. So I guess off the back of that, my question for you would be, what would you say, what would you define as British values in a sort of what we've seen as a bit of make Britain great again, which is not what I would think of as British values? How would you sort of phrase British values?
I think it's. I think that's a really good question, because I think it's really summed up in the sense of fair play. That to me is what being British is about, is that people have a fair chance at the whip, they have a fair chance to try stuff, are given a level playing field, and that's what's broken down. And so the inequality in society has allowed some people to do better and not brought up the others, and we all lose out if there isn't fair play. You know, we don't prosper. You know, if somebody's missing out on opportunity, we all lose out, like that guy in Blackpool. That's exactly the issue. And that sort of sense that people should be allowed fair play. And, you know, the postcode lotteries that's come through the NHS now, and social care, yeah, all of those things, they really matter. And, you know, as an ex-police officer, I find it really frustrating to watch as the criminal justice system has effectively been completely torn apart. And there's no fair play for somebody who is coming to court anymore, because there's just no money for legal aid, and so they can't be represented properly. Now, that isn't fair play. And I think that's the thing that defines us as a community. And generally, whenever you talk to somebody who might have said that immigration was their kind of leading reason that they voted for Brexit, it won't be about their neighbour who they care about, or their partner in some cases. It'll be the sense that they haven't had fair play, and it's a bit sort of, you know, like it's one remove from them. But I think if we can work around that theme of trying to provide that level playing field again, and that's about looking after people and investing properly and creating the dynamics so that the future, and we've got, you know, artificial intelligence is coming down the line. We need to be prepared for that, and we can. We just need to be thinking about it all now, and that's what Parliament should be doing when it's wasting its time and on things that, you know, it can't resolve. So I think there's so many things, but fair play to me, yeah, really decent. That's kind of British.
That's great. Thank you very much, Annabel, for joining us. That was Annabel Mullin, who's the leader of the Renew Party. And thank you very much for joining us here on Renew Kids on the Block podcast.